Abu Darham has a very amusing etymology for Hanukkah. He says, why is it called Hanukkah? Chanu bekaf he. And he really seems to take this seriously. Chanu, they came to rest on the 25th. It's two words. Now, what's curious about this is that he lived in the 1300s and he was still falling for this kind of popular etymology. You know, I mean, it was done in ancient times all the time. Not only in the Bible you have popular etymologies, but in the Talmud as well. So, peros bol, a Greek word, becomes peros, bole, ubote, and so on and so forth. So this is a wonderful tradition of popular etymologies. But in fact, they didn't need to look for an etymology because Hanukkah connects with Chanukhat HaMizbeach, and it had nothing to do with the fact that it was the 25th of Kislev, which was coincidental. But the Hanukkah, the word used, that was very deliberate. And as this morning's reading demonstrates, the rabbis felt that there was a connection between the Hanukkah, which means the dedication or the inauguration of the Mizbeach, as described in Parashat Naso, which we read today, and what the Hasmoneans were reenacting. So in other words, the Hasmoneans, who, as far as we know, were the ones to institute this festival called Hanukkah, they very consciously chose that name in order to connect up with the ancient biblical traditions. And that tells us a lot about what they were up to. They wanted to give legitimacy to something which really is illegitimate, halachically. Think about it. Who ever dared to institute a new festival? All our festivals are Torah festivals, and that's it. Every one of them. And then suddenly, in the years roughly 165 before the Common Era, which is relatively late, post-biblical period, all of a sudden these people who are, like upstarts, they write letters and tell the Jewish people, we want you to observe a holiday. It's the first time ever. I say it's the first time ever because Purim is almost certainly later. Although it is set in the Persian period, we can be as good as certain that it didn't happen then. And the Purim story reflects events, again, from the Hellenistic period. The story itself betrays so many clues to that date, and very little to the Persian. Only superficially are there some Persian words, loan words in Megillat Esther. But otherwise the story is of the Hellenistic period, and probably the same time as the Hasmonean story, or maybe a little later. In the second book of Maccabees, at the very end, it says that the 13th of Adar was fixed by the Hasmoneans, or another holiday, a minor holiday, which has been abolished since, and it was called Yom Nikanor. The Talmud talks about it at some length, and that was the 13th of Adar. And in the second book of Maccabees, it says, I know this, I was reading it again on Shabbat, hadn't read it for a long time, so I refreshed my memory and found many interesting things there. This is one of them, that the end it says, and that day of Nikanor is one day before the day of Mordechai. So what we call Purim today, they were calling the day of Mordechai. So there you are. So they had already Purim. That's the earliest reference. And that book is written around 100 years before the Common Era. So Purim, again, we think this is the earliest reference. So maybe it also came into existence around that time, around the time of the Hasmoneans. So they really tried to reform Judaism. So Hanukkah, many people have rightly said, is a kind of celebration of reform. It says it's okay to do things to praise God when we need to, even if it is not something which was prescribed by previous generations. Think about it. The Torah says don't add anything. Don't add. And somehow they got away with adding Hanukkah and to some extent Purim at a later date. But Hanukkah, in a way, is the more significant because they were pioneers. They did something so daring to say, this is so important in our lives, we have to mark it. Whether they were right or wrong is not the question. But the point is that our situation is different. Our forefathers did not go through what we went through. Our experience is different, and therefore our religious expression has to reflect that change, that new experience. So that's one of the main significances of Hanukkah, when we think about it. That we are actually celebrating something which is not in Torah Moshe, which is not biblical at all. And therefore, for those who were quote unquote orthodox, of course, this was anathema. And we have it on record in the Talmud that they protested very strongly, the elders, against Purim. What they did with Hanukkah is not so clear. There was another problem, though, with Hanukkah. That was that the Hasmoneans wanted it to commemorate their military victories. And that is absolutely not possible. To have a date when we thank God for miracles, that could be, although fixing a holiday is problematic, but if we're only, all we do on that day is not to refrain from work, but just to light the candles, behalel u'hoda'ah, the rabbis could allow that. Don't forget, the Hasmoneans are not the rabbis. The Hasmoneans are an upstart group of priests who do things their way. Because of their prestige, because they were the leaders of this revolt against the oppressor, so they really could almost do what they want, almost.
What was the status of the so-called quote-unquote rabbis at the time of the Hashmonaim?
Well, they had their own Hasidic.
Was it the Pharisaic?
It was just starting then. In the early days, they were the Hasidim, referred to in Psalm 149, the Kahal Hasidim. That psalm, I think, dates from that period. The Kahal Hasidim, that was the name of the people who later, from their midst, grew the Pharisees. But this is before they were sects per se. Anyway, the rabbis later, when we say the rabbis, we mean those who are responsible for the Talmud. So they were a different brand. They were people who did look to Scripture and felt very much that they must not veer too far from what the Torah says. They were very much bound. They felt that was the fundamental document. So perhaps the Hasmoneans didn't feel quite the same way about it. And for the rabbis, Hanukkah as a commemoration of a military victory was impossible, because that could not be squared with Torah Moshe. How do we know? First of all, Moses tells us in the Torah all about the much greater victories against Og Melech Bashan and Sichon Melech HaEmori, which were phenomenal victories. Okay? If you want to speak of a miraculous victory, this was it. A tiny nation of recently freed slaves in the desert, you can call them a horde, and they are confronted by established governments, yes, with huge armies, and Melech himself is depicted as something of an ogre, of a man, and the prophet also says, Asher kegova arazim govho, we just read it, v'chason hu ka'alonim. So we have that described in the prophet, that these people were very, very powerful, and they overcame them. But Moses does not give the date of that battle, never left the date, so it cannot be commemorated. So it's very deliberate. Contrary to other nations who were celebrating their military victories, Moses does not even allow for such a thing. It's completely precluded, and they never celebrated or anything like that. There's not even a shirah for that, unlike Yetziat Mitzrayim. So, and the same with Yehoshua, believe it or not. When they come into the land, these are the most significant battles of all, but no dates, nothing, and never is it commemorated. So for thousands of years of Jewish history, this was never allowed by any teacher in Israel, that you celebrate a military victory, because a war is a bad thing, a terrible tragedy. If it has to happen, so in mourning, if we are saved, so we can thank God for being saved. But we cannot commemorate that as if it were something to rejoice about, because there is no joy that wars are still required on our unredeemed earth. So that the rabbis could not accept. So they took that part away and they changed it. And they said, do you know why we keep Hanukkah? My Hanukkah, a very innocent question, as if nobody knows. And then they said, well, we'll tell you why. And this is the only authoritative explanation that we have for Hanukkah. So our Hanukkah is again a break with what the Hasmoneans wanted to do. And it says, no. We'll tell you why we celebrate Hanukkah. Because after whatever happened with the Hasmoneans, their name is mentioned very casually. They came to the temple and they wanted to light the menorah as required by the Torah, and there was no oil that could be used, because when the Greeks entered the temple, they defiled everything, and it has to be shemin, zayit, zach, katit maor, it has to be zach, and it has to be tahor. And the menorah itself, it says, ala menorah ha-tehorah, in the Torah. So it had to be pure according to the purity laws laid down in the Torah itself. So it must not have contact with corpses or anything like that which will defile it. Well, because of the war and so on, presumably there were corpses everywhere, and they couldn't find. They found one little cruse, though, which was sealed, oil inside, and it was made of earthenware. And according to the Torah, kelecheres mitame mitocho, cannot become defiled from outside. V'chol keli patuach asher en samid patil alav tamehu. That's what the Torah says in 19th chapter of Numbers, right? An earthenware vessel which is not sealed, that becomes unclean in the oil hamet. But if it's sealed, it does not, because so that's the rule, only becomes defiled according to the laws of priestly purification if the unclean substance went inside it. But if it's sealed and nothing can go inside it, even if it touches it from outside, it remains tahor. Now, how do you know the thing was sealed and no one could open it? Because it still had on it the high priest's seal. And it wasn't broken, the seal. So he said, here we have oil, we can light the menorah. But there was so little inside that little cruse, it was just enough for one night. And it burnt, and they kept pouring. This is the miracle of Elisha as well. So it was a repetition of Elisha's miracle, if you remember, when also this poor woman had nothing. And he said to her, pour the oil, keep pouring the oil, and use as many vessels as you can. And the oil went on and on and on. So it's obvious that this is modeled on the Elisha story, and it's very important to understand that that's what the rabbis had in mind. They're trying to connect it in order to justify it, to make it palatable from the halachic point of view. This is an okay miracle. A miracle of where God will make a miracle with oil and let it last and last and last is written in the Torah. So we can have that miracle, and that is appropriate to celebrate, and that will be the meaning henceforth of Hanukkah. No more are we to talk about wars, and the Hasmoneans and their battles are something that, if we remember at all, it's a bittersweet memory, but certainly not cause for celebration. So today, when we celebrate, as following in the tradition of the rabbis, we're not allowed to bring in the milchamot, and we don't. Unfortunately, in some communities, they have inserted the word milchamot into their ala nesim. And in fact, I have to say this, that some argue that the ala nesim, milchamot, may be original. How come? Because the ala nesim seems not to recognize the miracle of the oil. It doesn't say that. It does say vaguely at the end, v'hidliku nerot b'chatzrot kodechecha, but doesn't make a big deal out of it. Whereas to Rabbinic Judaism, that is central. It is all about the miracle of the oil. And yet the Ala Nesim doesn't even say there was a miracle with the oil. How come? So this comes from a different school, from somewhere in the middle. It's not, it doesn't glorify the Hasmoneans completely, but it's not yet talking about the miracle of the oil as the central miracle of Hanukkah. It just says, V'hidliku nerot bechatzrot kochecha, not perhaps a little bit aware, perhaps not yet fully aware of this story. And it may be that in that prayer called Ala Nisim, there was still some hankering after what the Hasmoneans had wanted it to be, a day to recollect the victories, and so the word milchamot may be original there. I'm not here going to say that I know for sure which is original. It's very hard to establish which is original. Sephardim have never said milchamot. You can see not in Be'ala Nesim nor anywhere else. It's out. And others have so loved the milchamot, they've even put it into Hanerot Halalu. Some. Okay, that's in a nutshell the story of Hanukkah. Now, who goes first? I don't know who went first. Okay.
Were there any other, at that time of the year, pagan holidays in the Middle East that they were... We learned about the Christian holiday and how they tried to make a pagan holiday more into a religious holiday. Yes. Was that any part of the Hanukkah celebration?
Well, that leads to this question of why on the 25th of Kislev. And that is an important question, because if you read even the books of Maccabees and Josephus and everywhere else, you see that any date really could have been chosen. Some have argued, because the wars went on for years and for generations. It wasn't like it happened, and at this moment you could say, this is it. The danger is over, and the wars are over. Think of modern Israel today. You know, it goes on and on and on, many different battles. When do you say, I mean, the case of modern Israel, you could say when independence happened, that was the important thing. And to some extent, this is true of the Hasmoneans, when they cleared the temple, they felt that was already, that they had gained some kind of independence. It was very limited, and there were many more wars still ahead. But it may be that it really happened, that on that day, they regained the temple in Jerusalem, and that was symbolic of a very important event, so they fixed it on that day. It's possible. But others have argued, as you say, that no, they could have chosen any date, but there was an old festival on the 25th of December, the solar calendar. We don't know which calendar they had then. That's another question, a secondary question about the calendar, but it's much too complicated for now. The Talmud tells us that the 25th day, that means the fourth day after the solstice, which is the 21st of December, was a holiday, the oldest holiday known to humanity. Who instituted Christmas? Exactly. Adam HaRishon. Because when he saw the days getting shorter and shorter, he got very, very anxious. And he said, these are the words in the Talmud, "Woe unto me, because of me the world is coming to an end. And we're going back to darkness and tohu vavohu." And he felt not only guilty, but also very depressed that, that's it, that's the end. And this must be what God meant when he said that Beyom achalcha b'menu, on the day you die, you will bring punishment with it, and so on. This is it, this is the punishment. And then, that kept on, that process, until the 21st. And then on the 22nd, he thought to himself, it seems to me the day is a few minutes longer. And then he said, no, I'm a fool. It's just wishful thinking. And the next day, by the third day, he was so convinced. He said, no, this is not wishful thinking. This is really getting longer. And at that moment, he became a scientist, the Talmud tells us. And he said, Darko shel olam, this is the way of creation. This is the way of creation. And that was such an important moment when Adam moved from being a man of superstition into a man who observes nature, observes closely the laws of nature, and becomes what we call a scientist. And that was cause for celebration. And then he fixed that day forever to be 25th of December in the solar calendar. And that is the oldest festival, and it was always kept until the Talmud intimates that they turned it into an idolatrous feast, and then, of course, Jews distanced themselves from it, but probably not totally. And since they had a feast of lights, it had to do with lights, so some think that the Hashmonaim, rather than create a totally new holiday, they said to the people, okay, you know, a lot of you shouldn't be doing it, but you're celebrating Adam HaRishon's festival. Let's co-opt it and give it a new meaning and let it be Hanukkah. So this, then, if this is true, there are a lot of hints, and Eli is quite right to bring up this question, and I think that's what he had in mind, right? And some historians think this is the truth of the matter. So now, again, we're back to where Adam HaRishon was. It fell into desuetude. Jews were not doing it because it became a pagan festival. But then, somehow, through these events of Hanukkah, they were able to reclaim it and make it a very Jewish festival, because we commemorate the miracle that God intervenes and God gives us light and so on. So it's very close to Adam HaRishon's festival, that God gave the light. After darkness seemed to be enveloping the whole earth, suddenly it starts again to get lighter.
So is that
And it's also then a celebration, indirectly, of light, and light of the mind which overcomes superstition, because before that Adam HaRishon was superstitious. Everything was a punishment. And now he decided, no, I mustn't see myself as the center of everything. Not everything revolves around me. God has a great world, a great universe with its own laws.
So is that the intention of the Christians with their instituting sort of a light in their holiday?
It was very late. The church adopted it very, very late for the same reasons.
No, but is it the same?
It's the same. The old pagan festival was everywhere. It came from Adam HaRishon. So it was everywhere, in Europe, the whole world. This was a human... all of humanity had it. And so, at least in this hemisphere, not in down under, of course, because for them it's not in December, the solstice, but in Europe and in much of the ancient world, as far as we know, this was a celebration which went back to Adam HaRishon. The church didn't like it because it was a pagan one. So they did, perhaps, this, if it's true, the Hasmoneans co-opted the Adam festival and made out of it Hanukkah. So then the church may have known this and said, oh, that's a good idea. We'll do the same as the Hasmoneans did in their day. We can't get rid of this festival. It's never going to go away. It's so entrenched. Let's give it a new meaning. And so they gave it a new meaning. But you must remember, the Puritans would have none of this. They said it's a pagan festival. And the Puritans who came to America, they fled partly because they didn't want Christmas. That's why they came to America, to get away from it. All Christian Puritans were opposed to it. They said, this is a pagan festival and has nothing to do with us, and we will not celebrate it.
The part of the lights or the part
Everything. Anything to do with any holiday on the 20th of December is out of the question. But the church sometimes was able to succeed in giving it a new meaning, but a lot of the old tradition stayed. So the lights stayed. Many of the elements that belonged to the oldest, we say pagan, but it wasn't pagan. According to the Talmud, it was not. It was originally a good thing. So we too, in our Hanukkah, we can identify with Adam HaRishon because it's again to do with lights. So that's very interesting, that's the part that has survived. All the rest has gone, and what remains is the lights and thanking God. So it's exactly what we do today is what Adam HaRishon was doing. So it also, through the rabbis' intervention, it became a universalistic holiday. If it had been to celebrate the Hasmoneans, it would be a very tribal holiday. It would be about us versus them again, which is of no permanent interest. It may boost the ego of Yehuda Maccabi and his children and his family, yes, but it's of no permanent interest. But by the rabbis doing away with all that and leaving only the miracle of the lights, so they made it a festival of lights, which is very universal and very meaningful, I guess. Okay, who was going next? I think you were twice. So it has to be your turn.
You mentioned before that the Hashmonaim are the reformers.
Yes.
But in the story of Hanukkah, they are going against the Hellenistic reformers, and they're the traditionalists.
Well, these are always labels. How people see themselves is something very different from what they really are. And we always have to stand back and ask ourselves. The book of Maccabees is a piece of propaganda. It's written only from their point of view, and it has very nasty things to say. Well, both. Second one is very, very poor and really quite a wretched little book. First one has class to it. First one was written in Hebrew, and someone who knew Hebrew and was learned in Torah. The second one is written by a man who didn't even know Hebrew. He wrote in Greek. The whole book was written in Greek, and he was an Am Haaretz, you could say. I'm sorry, and he didn't know a lot. And he made up all these stories about flames inside a well and other absurdities. He was a very half-baked kind of man. What?
He would have been a good filmmaker.
Yes, he's got a good story there. That he has. There you are, see? Takes one to recognize me. David.
So now I'm almost afraid to ask my question, but I'll go ahead anyway. So you seem to be expressing some distaste for this reformation of creating or fixing a holiday. In the Book of Maccabees 1, we read a nice story where the Hashmonaim went into the desert. Some zealots were in the desert, and maybe the assimilationists, the Hellenistic Jews, or the Greeks themselves go out to woo them out of the caves, and they refuse. And on Shabbat, they realize they won't defend themselves, and they go in and wipe them all out.
Yes.
And then the Hashmonaim say, they're said to say that, oh well, if we don't defend ourselves on the Sabbath, we'll end up like our brothers. So they institute a reform that it's okay to defend oneself on the Sabbath. When I read that, I was quite impressed. And so, vis-a-vis that reformation, which seems to be a very impressive one. Yes. Of course, it's in the first book of Maccabees, so we don't really know when it came into the picture, right? But that seems like a good reform. To me, it seemed like a step in the right direction. Right. So, how do you...
Well, first of all, I have to correct an impression that may or may not have emerged from what I said earlier. I don't think that I'm saying or making any value judgment about it. I just stated a fact that it was definitely a reform. Torah gave us the festivals, and it says, Ele Moadei Hashem, these are the festivals of the Lord, which will come Chodesh, and then it emphasizes, Ele Moadai. And almost certain that means these and no others. The Talmud always says, Ele Moadai is emphatic. This is it, closed. You cannot add anything. And no one did historically. No one, not David HaMelech, not King Solomon. King Solomon had a great dedication. They all had tremendous events in their lives that might have justified a new festival. They didn't do it. No one did. So it is a very remarkable and very daring, I say again, reform, to go against tradition. Think about it. No one dared to introduce a festival. Not Ezra, not Nehemiah. People say, oh, Purim. But Purim is later, historically. Although it says Queen Esther did it, and Mordechai, and so on. But we know historically that that's not so, and that these are all characters of the Hasmonean period, and that Haman is a thoroughly Hellenistic man, and everything he says about the Jews being different from all other people, that can only describe the Hellenistic period, not the Persian Empire, where everyone had their own culture, and it was a very tolerant society. The Persian Empire was extremely tolerant, and you see the king says to Koresh, says to the Jews, you go and build a temple. They probably would never have built that second temple if not for the nudging from the Persians. So the Persians wanted, that was what they believed in. And certainly he could not have said to a Persian king, Yeshno Amecha, there is one people who's different from all other peoples. That is so typically Hellenistic, because the Hellenists wanted this uniformity, and they tried to spread it. And then the Jews stuck out as a sore thumb, and these are the complaints you hear at that period from Greek pagan writers. Why are the Jews different? But only then were they different. They were not different in the Persian Empire, Mehod Dove Atkush. So we know that Purim is late. We know that the Megillah, it was written at a very late date. We know there's no evidence of it ever from the time of the Persian Empire all the way down to the very late Second Temple period. So there was none, we could say, before Hanukkah. No, historically there was none introduced. And we know also that the Hasmoneans themselves did not have a Purim to look to, because there was no Purim. So we can be confident that they knew they were doing something very, very daring. Okay, but that doesn't mean it's good or bad. I'm just making, that's all. I only stated a fact. By saying it's daring doesn't mean it's bad. You could say it was very courageous of them. And therefore, this idea that reforms are good or bad, I think is quite absurd, because as you said yourself, some reforms are good, some are not good. But they've always happened until the 19th century, when the biggest reform of all set in. I've said this before, when a movement calling itself Orthodox suddenly came out of nowhere and said, anything new is against the Torah. Well, that was the biggest reform of all. To stop the development of the religion in its tracks and freeze it. This no one had done before. You can argue about individual and specific reforms, that they're good or bad, and that's what always happened before. If something was considered to be contrary to Torah, it was judged on its merits, not this blanket idea that change in itself, even if it's for the better, is not a good thing. This did untold damage, and in some quarters we're still suffering from it today, because there's still this idea that even if you know something is wrong that you're doing, you still do it because it's more important to be traditional than to be doing the right thing. So they made an avodah zarah, an idol, out of this thing called tradition. And that's very, very scary. And we are seeing some of the fruits, the bad fruits of that reform today. So was that a good reform? I'm not blaming the people. Perhaps they didn't have the foresight to see what they were doing and how bad it was. Perhaps it was just a gut reaction. They didn't know what to do with the other kinds of reforms. So they said, okay, no change until we can discuss it and we can think about it, which can be a wise thing to do. Let's not be too hasty. And I like to judge them that way and to say that that's all they meant. They just meant, for the moment, let's not change anything because it's all happening too quickly. Let's consider it seriously. But then it became an end in itself, just to stagnate. So of course, I'm not saying reform is good or bad. I'm just saying that everything must be judged on its merit. And reform for its own sake, which seems to be very dear to the so-called reform movement, that is also has no Torah merit whatsoever. To decide that, well, we just want to change for the sake of change. I mean, it's meaningless. It's insipid and meaningless, I think. Okay.
Happy, you mentioned before that the idea of milchama was sort of eradicated from
Hanukkah, yeah. Right.
Concept of winning over the enemy. We didn't want it, but yet you have Moshe's Shira, and it is said every day. Of course, we didn't say it. But it's said every day by
since when? Not the ancient rabbis never instituted it to be recited every day. It's very important to note that. It's a very late invention to say it.
How late is it?
Medieval. Yeah.
Medieval.
Yes, nowhere in the Talmud, nowhere, not in the Bavli, not in the Yerushalmi, no such thing.
Why do you think
Well, in some communities they wanted to say different things, and there are all kinds of reasons. Some people have said because the Talmud in Brachot says, Chasidim Arishonim, hayu shohim sha'a achat. They spent an hour in meditation before tefillah. And this is written, so I'm not making this up, this is written in books, old books of the time. They say, to conform with that idea, which the Chasidim Arishonim, we also, before we come to the tefillah proper, we spend some time, or an hour, some say, I don't know if sha'ah meant necessarily 1 hour, it meant some time meditating and reciting psalms and other passages from the Bible, so that we will have the right frame of mind by the time we reach tefillah proper, which for them was Baruch Hu, Yotzer, Shema, and Amidah. So it was done in order to fulfill what is written in the Talmud, that the Chasidim Arishonim shohim sha'ah achat. So there was not everyone did it, and it was certainly not meant for everybody. So this meditation. So they did have passages which they felt were suitable for meditation, and that's where it all comes from. And then it became, everybody wants to be a chassid, everyone wants to be more and more. But in some communities, it worked, but in other communities, it didn't. It had a contrary effect, especially in those communities where their Hebrew was not so perfect. And so, instead of becoming an hour of meditation, it became an hour of mumbling and saying things which they didn't really understand and saying things by rote. And as time went on and on, so printers started printing these prayers, and it became like a fixed part of the prayer to be said every day. And this did not help very much. So that hour was not really a preparation for tefillah. By the time people got to tefillah, they were looking at their watches.
It's better thought of as a catch-up. This has a chance to catch up.
Yeah.
If we walk in late.
Well, they didn't walk in late in the old times because they started with the Baruch Hu in the synagogue. And therefore the whole service would have taken however long they wanted. The Hasidim Arishonim who wanted to spend an hour meditating, they came before Baruch Hu. If they knew Baruch Hu was starting at dawn or Amud HaShah, whenever they did it, they would arrive earlier and do their meditating. Okay? If they did it in Bet Knesset. But they did not impose this on the tzibur, they did it as individuals. Okay? But if a whole community chooses it wants to spend an hour in meditation, that's also fine. That's a voluntary thing. But it shouldn't be part of the regular tefillah, which is imposed on people who are coming, to be there, and they're a captive audience, and people thought they could just add and add and add. And that really undermined tefillah because it made it a parrot cacophony instead of tefillah. Or tended to. Okay? That's it on Hanukkah, right? We've already moved into tefillah. More on Hanukkah?
No, well, you mentioned something.
Well, our chairperson must decide. Because
Isaac.
how long for Hanukkah were we told? Oh, Isaac is an exception. Okay.
Isaac.
You said
It's over there with you.
Okay, if you say.
They said the 25th, and you don't know if it was a solar calendar.
We don't know what calendar they had at that time.
Can you discuss a little bit about that?
Well, the calendar?
Calendar?
Oh, that's
I know the whole thing is
detail.
it is. It really is.
Just a quick.
It's too complicated. The calendar question is really very difficult. What we know for sure, what we know with absolute certainty today is that the Essenes and the people of Jubilees, who wrote the book of Jubilees, which is early, had a fixed calendar, a solar calendar. The problem is, and this everybody knows, anyone who's read the Torah or just listens to it, is aware that the Torah, on the one hand, tells us that the festivals must be tied to the solar cycle. For instance, Pesach has to be Aviv. Shamor et chodesh ha'aviv ve'asita Pesach. It starts with those words, Shamor et chodesh ha'aviv. You must keep it in the month. Ki b'chodesh ha'aviv utziacha Hashem l'chem laila. Aviv is solar.
Why is that so?
Because look at the Muslims who have a lunar year. The seasons can change. They're not fixed.
No, the festival.
Aviv, everything changes. The months change. Right, but the season has a relation. I said it wrong. The months, all the months. So Ramadan, for instance, can be anywhere, summer, winter, anytime, because it's roughly 354 years only, and the solar year is 365 days and change, not 354 days. So therefore, the Torah requires, and with all the festivals, it says about Sukkot, Tekufat Hashana. It's so clear, over and over again, it tells us you must make sure that Sukkot should be at the time of when you gather in your fruit from the field. And Shavuot, Ketzir Chetim. This you may not change. So, it is primarily a solar calendar, we could say. It is only a lunar calendar insofar as the Torah does tell us also to mark Rosh Chodesh. Not a big deal though. Rosh Chodesh is not that important, but it does say Rosh Chodeshechem. It mentions Rosh Chodesh here and there as a day to be celebrated. So that means we have to have a luni-solar or solely-lunar calendar. We can't ignore the one and put all our eggs in one basket. We can't do that. We have to have both. So different people thought about it in different ways. How much should we emphasize the solar aspect, and how much leeway should we give to the month, to the moon? And this was the big argument. And each one could prove their case from the Torah. The Essenes, we know, and the Book of Jubilees had this fixed calendar of 364 days, and then they added leap days every 4 years. It's all written there in their books very, very clearly, and now there's a huge spate of books on this subject so that we can have a very good idea of what it was like. That's something we know, and we know it was going on for a very long time. Now the question is, how ancient was this calendar? Is this really the old Jewish calendar, the fixed one? Because it would fit perfectly with the Torah. If you keep this calendar, you're really observing the Torah. You can't go wrong. You know that you'll do Abib, you'll do Chag HaAsif, you know Shavuot will be the right time. Everything's going to be in order, and you can still do Rosh Chodesh. Or can you? Not so good. Rosh Chodesh doesn't come out so good.
But the idea of having that at that time was because of the agricultural society. In today's time, if you change that date, we're not going to be we won't be as affected as they were then.
Well,
we have planes, we have trains, we have automobiles.
What does this do with changing? That was a fixed calendar for the whole world. There's nothing to do with change.
The intention of the holiday, as we know it, is a gathering to be together, to praise God, to recognize that God is the one. And so should it make that much of a difference to us? That's my question.
Well, the Torah says the reason it has to be in Abib is ki bechodesh ha'abib hosiach Hashem lokechem Mitzrayim, because that's when it happened.
But that's because
it doesn't say that.
But we know that was what was going on.
How do we know? I don't see that we can very easily get away from what's so clearly stated in the Torah over and over again. The Torah wanted our festivals to be at certain seasons, which are determined by the solar cycle, is clear as daylight, and no one ever doubted that. The only question was, well, how much can we respect Rosh Chodesh, and how much does the Torah want us? How much store should we place by Rosh Chodesh? And that's the whole question. Now, that was the old calendar, it was a fixed calendar. Then the Pharisees introduced their empirical calendar, which people used to always say, that's the authentic, that's the old Jewish calendar. We know today it's not so. We know today that it was not so. Well, I can't go into it any further, because there's much more to be said. Well,
did they ever do the empirical calendar?
Who? The Pharisees did. The Pharisees would watch the moon, and they would fix Rosh Chodesh always according
Did they
to...
ever have the bonfires and all that stuff?
The Pharisees? Yes.
How long? Did it last long?
Well, they tried to have their calendar imposed on everyone, but the only time, sometimes they were in ascendancy, perhaps in the very late second. Here's someone who knows much more about the Pharisees, so I'm not going to say too much. In his presence, I may be making a mistake. Someone has written about them quite a lot. I think that in the late Second Temple, they did have quite a lot of clout in the temple, and after the destruction of the temple, then they fixed it from Yavneh and so on. That we know. That's for sure. They were doing this empirical calendar in Yavneh under Rabban Gamliel, and that was the heyday of the empirical calendar, believe it or not, for some generations. But then, of course, it didn't really work, and then they again gave us the fixed calendar. There's a big argument when exactly. Perhaps after the Romans put an end to the patriarchy in Israel in the year 325. We have to thank the Christians for that. The Romans, however intolerant they were, they never took away the patriarchy from the Jews. That they respected. That had gone on for so long. But when Constantine came, and he had no qualms and no respect for anybody. You either had to be a Christian or else get lost. There was no room in their world for anybody else. It was the most intolerant system that the world had probably ever known. And right away, no patriarch. That's it. Without any courtesy, without any decency towards antiquity, nothing. Nothing mattered to them. They just trampled over everybody. And that was a new chapter in Jewish history. They'd never experienced such a thing before. At least the Romans they were cruel, but they had some derech eretz. And if you didn't hurt them, they left you alone. The church, it didn't matter. Even if you didn't hurt anybody, you were going your own sweet way. That was a kind of fanaticism which, unfortunately, well, that's a sorry story that we can't tell today. Okay. So that's all I can say about the calendar today. But of course, I know it's an inadequate answer.